So digital identities is something that is most definitely coming our way.
Welcome to the Digital Customer Communications podcast, where we discover how leading regulated companies engage, retain, and delight customers at scale. Today, we're looking at how financial crime is evolving and how regulated companies are responding. With rising regulatory pressure and increasingly sophisticated threats, institutions must rethink how they use data, technology, and digital transformation to stay ahead. Joining us is Matt Beattie, co-founder of BeyondFS and a specialist in financial services transformation, operations, compliance, and control. Hi, Matt.
Hi, good to be here, Sam.
Thank you so much for giving us your time. Can you set the scene a little bit for us in giving us a kind of big picture view of what financial crime encompasses and how it's evolved over the last 3 to 4 years?
Yeah, it's a really sort of interesting topic, and it encompasses so much. But essentially, we're looking as an industry to keep bad actors out of the system and make sure we limit or inhibit their ability to use the financial systems to their gain. It's an ever evolving landscape, and it's one that will never stop. It's something where the financial criminals are constantly trying to get ahead, and the organizations as part of the financial system are ever trying to combat. But if we think about the last few years, fraud continues to be on the rise and is something that is absolutely sort of front and centre of many of the aspects that are being looked at the moment. But also there are other items that drive the agenda as well, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine drove a huge amount of sanctions activity over the last few years. Or things like the COVID pandemic that drove a lot more activity online very, very rapidly and opened the door potentially to cyber threats that hadn't previously been as prevalent. So there's many aspects of it, and just thinking about really the growth of financial crime within the system, also regulations expanding to other parties that weren't necessarily as closely scrutinised previously. Professional agents, so estate agents or accountants may also be captured by some of the rules and regulations that previously they weren't looked at as closely.
With everything moving so quickly, it must be hard for regulation to keep up. How have you seen regulatory priorities shift in response to these threats, and how have you seen them, I guess, change the way that they roll out and think about how fast they roll out regulation in response to this kind of acceleration of activity?
Yeah, it's been a difficult one to manage, both for the industry, the organisations within the industry, but as much for the regulators as well. They're trying to keep on the front foot as much as they possibly can. We're definitely seeing that move from looking at a rule-based system where the regulators are saying, they'd expect you to meet certain obligations, to a much more sort of risk-focused approach where the regulators really looking at the organisations to identify where are their financial crime risks and how are they addressing them, and be much more proactive about that rather than being reactive to the rules that the regulators are putting in place.
When we talk about financial crime evolving, what are the sort of key trends that we've seen over the last couple of years? We've had a lot of new regulation. We've also had increasingly sophisticated threats.
Yeah, there's many sort of threats that are coming through now. So I mentioned the fraud aspects that have been front and centre for a good while, but are ever increasing. And with some of the technologies that are coming into place now, we're already seeing fraudsters use some fairly advanced techniques of AI and encompassing some of the technologies there. But we're also seeing, as I say, as organisations have moved online, and they've moved online fairly rapidly over the last few years, much more sophistication about targeting individuals, extracting information from them, and then using that against them to gain access to the financial systems. So we're seeing rules that have come in around APP fraud, for example, came in last year, which applies a much more punitive regime. So the organisations are having to pay much more attention to how they address that and how they respond and react to that sort of area.
When we talk about organizations, we're talking about organizations of lots of different scales. I think you guys work with mostly enterprise orgs, but there are there are different priorities, different risks at those different scales. At the larger end of the scale, you've got a lot of, I imagine, legacy tech that's still there. Having gone through lots of digital transformation work, there's still a lot of stuff that needs patching up, that needs fixing, that needs updating. So you've got that presents a vulnerability. And then for SMEs, SMBs, you've got, well, they just don't have the resource and to be able to keep up with the acceleration of threats. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's certainly an aspect of it. One of the challenges around enterprise organizations is the breadth of business they often do. So their breadth or their risks that they face are huge, and they have to respond in many, many different ways, and they have to be able to use their technologies effectively to do that. And inevitably, with an extremely rapidly advancing landscape, their technologists aren't able to keep up with that, and they're based on legacy technology, as you mentioned, and sometimes that's maybe not the best approach or not the ideal approach that you would typically take if you had more time to think about what does your architecture look like and how might you respond to that. But you're also right about the other end of the spectrum. Some of the fintech organizations or some of the smaller organizations, they essentially have the same obligations that they need to address. Typically, they have a narrower focus because their business is narrow in terms of what it's doing. But then they don't have the many, many years of experience and the level of resourcing or perhaps the funding that the larger organizations do to make sure those controls are in place. So two quite different challenges, but both challenges nonetheless.
And you mentioned AI there. We can't not talk about AI at the moment. It's obviously an issue when we're talking about fraud, conducting fraud, but there's also the other end in that organizations can use AI to analyze behavior and to understand fraud and to pick up sort of idiosyncrasies and anomalies in activity. How much is this already being used for good versus bad?
Different aspects of AI, so certainly things like machine learning are used quite extensively within a number of organizations. That gives them an extremely powerful tool set that they can deploy to analyze, assess a huge volume of data that a human-centric team simply wouldn't be able to do, and to spot some quite unusual patterns that are maybe quite nuanced as well. So those sorts of technologies are fairly well advanced, and certainly with the right funding and the right focus on those programs, typically within the larger organizations, they are able to deploy some very sort of powerful tool sets. The other aspect of that, of course, is the technology can do the part of the work, which is analyzing huge swathes of data, and make sure that the human-centric teams are able to really look at the risk aspects of those and just be looking at the positive or the flags that come out of that. So that part of AI in terms of that machine learning, as I say, has been used quite extensively. We are seeing other aspects of AI come into the industry, but typically it's at a much earlier stage and is really still being experimented with in terms of the sandboxes and are being put into pilots or trials with certain organizations. So there's definitely a range there. And again, the regulator is looking at it very carefully and is experimenting themselves in terms of where might this be used and how might this be used as well. In terms of from the criminal side of things, unfortunately, we don't know quite how extensively that they're using it, but we know they definitely are using it. They've always been at the forefront of technology. It's absolutely within their interest to do it. And given the availability and the accessibility of things like AI, almost we have to expect them to be using it and to be using it in many, many different ways. There are obviously some headline cases. We see deep fakes, or even just the other day that the realism of a expense receipt came through from ChatGPT that pretty much everybody has access to. So that technology and capability is absolutely there for the criminals, and they'll absolutely use it.
If I'm a large organization and I'm looking to tighten my defenses against fraud and financial crime, like you say, there's such a broad scope. How do you have a step-by-step sort of framework that you go through? Obviously, there's no, end of your blog post, this is the checklist you need to follow at that level. But you obviously take organizations through a framework, through certain steps when you go through these large projects. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. It always starts with understanding or clarifying what your risk is. What risk is that business facing? What type of business is it doing? Where are those financial crime risks? Where potentially are you open to those risks? And there'll be parts of your business that might be more open to some risks than others as well. So thinking about segmenting the business as well. So getting a really clear understanding of what your business is doing is the critical first step of that. Now, I would love to be saying to you today that we're always forward looking. We're always looking at the new rules and how do we combat this ahead of time. There's a reality which is in many circumstances, we're brought into situations where an issue has already arisen. There's already been regulatory findings and we have to remediate that. And of course, we'll address those as well. But the same principles apply. Understanding the risk, what obligations do we have, and also how do we best tackle that, but within an overall financial crime framework. So the business understands what it needs to do, who needs to be doing it, but then just thinking about what are those incremental gains. One of the challenges we see with organizations is sometimes they set off on a huge enterprise-wide financial crime program, and that can get lost very, very quickly. So we're always urging organizations, yes, think big, design big, but then start small and start tackling those immediate challenges. They'll inevitably be there and be able to sort of gain traction through that way. So getting in those shorter term gains, starting to gain the sort of traction with that, and we call that our sort of optimize phase, and then we go into our sort of strategic forward looking build better phase, which is how do we make sure that we've got a really robust controlled environment for the future.
What kind of pitfalls do you usually see businesses falling into when they're undertaking this themselves? Is it not following the right framework, I guess? Is it not knowing their goals? Is it attacking too broad a spectrum of risks at the same time?
There can sometimes be a tendency, and it's entirely understandable, but there can be sometimes a tendency for organizations to just simply want to do what others are doing on the street, on the market. And simply getting to a response phase of we need to do this laundry list of 25 things, and if we do those 25 things, we're good. And they miss that step around what are the actual risks to our business. So it goes back to that, really clarify your risk and really sort of understand that. But assuming you've done that, I think one of the key areas where we see many organizations with challenges is they'll start to engage a vendor, often a technology vendor, but I'll be honest, it can be consultants as well, and they want to outsource that challenge to somebody else. Those organizations are neither know your business as well as you will do, nor are they as incentivized to give you a holistic solution. They want to give you the solution that they already have and they can offer to you. So I think it's really important that organizations stay close to that financial crime program and really a strategy and really look to sort of own it and be continually thinking about how does it evolve over the course of time.
Talked about tools, but in terms of awareness and training for that kind of program, we work with clients on cybersecurity and we talk about, cybersecurity and secure communications. That's everybody's responsibility within a business. It's not just the compliance team. Obviously, you work very closely with compliance, but I imagine you take a similar approach to training and awareness. Can you talk a little bit to that?
There's a huge part of our job is the people side of things, and you're absolutely right. Some of that are the compliance individuals that are involved in that, but many of that are the business-facing individuals or the technology individuals or the operations teams as well. And really, what we're always trying to do is bring those team members together to gain a level of common understanding about what do they need to get done and how do they most effectively do it, to understand which parts of the puzzle are the different teams doing so they know what is being covered where and then what are their obligations to cover as well and how they fit into that bigger picture. But making sure we're taking people on that journey and we're not just simply implementing a new framework or implementing a new system or a new approach is really important. We've definitely seen with organisations where they have had these things brought in, and whilst the framework itself might be good and solid, because the people didn't either understand it or incorporate it into their sort of business as usual activities, it simply didn't get adopted the way it should have done it, and it wasn't effective as a result.
I imagine that sort of people culture aspect really impacts how fast you can move as well. You know, in financial services, we're kind of known for being sometimes slower than other industries when it comes to digital transformation. And things like compliance and regulation are often seen as blockers rather than enablers. I think that's changing now. But how do you have any advice for firms, for companies on moving faster through these types of programs?
So we absolutely do, and it's all around that people aspect as you're sort of coming back to it, but bringing those teams together. We are always looking through our projects. Inevitably, we're sort of crossing boundaries between the different teams, and we're always looking to bring those stakeholders together to form a common goal. It's amazing some of the initiatives, large transformation programs we've been involved in, and where there's a really, really clear goal that the team are all pointed at, how quickly that organisation will move and will transform if there's clarity around that and they're all working together. But you're absolutely right. Many organisations maybe don't have that clarity or don't have that cohesion across the different teams, and then it become very, very challenging in terms of moving those things forward. So getting those people together, and we often advocate to get them in the same room and really be talking those through. If you can hear the technologists talk about how they're going to respond to a next release or a next iteration or a new platform that's coming in, they will often give much richer information in the room about how they're actually going to do that. And you will then start to find that compliance people will start to engage with them or challenge them on it or ask them further questions and really start to put colour on how it needs to go forward.
I think a lot of the reason why some of these projects struggle to gain momentum in enterprise orgs is that the issues are so abstracted from the customer. In many senses, you know, if you're talking about AI as an example, AI analyzing behavior at scale across accounts, you're so abstracted from the individual that it's quite hard to make that link. Do you have any anecdotes, words of wisdom you can give us on the kind of impact that these programs have at the customer level?
It's always a really fascinating exercise to go and look at a certain operation, a certain process, a certain compliance function, and purely think of that of how does this impact the customer and what sort of experience do they get out of this? We've worked with some of the largest organisations in the world, and at times there have been situations where they would send out tomes of paper to either individuals or organisations, asking them to wet sign those documents, asking them to fill in repeat information. Naturally, the customer gets very frustrated and then starts to disengage from that process as well. Or there'll simply be times where the customer's being presented with quite conflicting information, and then how do they treat that, and they start to lose faith in the process. We always are urging the organisations that we work with and our clients that we work with to engage with their clients or really look at it from the client's perspective. Does the client understand why you're asking about this? Typically, we find that clients actually don't resist a somewhat amount of friction in the process, in the system, because it gives them a level of assurance that checks are being done and the organisation cares about that they don't get defrauded or they don't set up their accounts in the wrong way. But that has to be managed really, really carefully in terms of that engagement and making sure that client understands why they're being asked for this information. And if you are needing to ask for information that's quite detailed or is quite personal, providing just a little bit of context about why that is needed and what it's trying to protect the whole system from. And customers often respond very positively to that.
There are always going to be customers who don't. In terms of communicating that well, you know, why we have to do this, would you say it's more a contextual thing? So that should be done in the moment rather than an educational type of campaign that goes out to all customers around the program that you're running, or would you do both?
I do think you need to do a little bit of both, but I would definitely say that context is everything. So if you can be feeding them just that little bit of information, that little bit of knowledge at the time that you're either asking for information or you're going through a process, I think that means a huge amount or can make a really significant impact. versus just broad enterprise-wide communications, which of course some people will read, but many won't as well. If I take a slightly different scenario in terms of making payments more recently, we'll all be familiar with the checks that come up saying, are you sure you know this person? Are you being pressurized to make this payment? Are you confident of who the payee is? And there's a certain level of friction there, but having that context in the moment of making a payment, I think the vast majority of customers understand why they're being asked that, and just that moment to make them stop and think can decrease the amount of fraud cases significantly.
And I can imagine there's more technology than just AI that's on the horizon for preventing fraud in that way. I'm thinking, I'm just going to throw terms at you like decentralized identities, blockchain, big data. How are these things being factored into the mix?
Yeah, I definitely. So digital identities is something that is most definitely coming our way. Decentralization is probably that little bit further away, but I can absolutely perceive the benefits of that and having them, whether it's on a blockchain or equivalent. But countries such as Denmark already use digital identities on a personal basis fairly extensively. The EU are mandating them from 2027. We're most definitely moving in that direction, and obviously a very positive direction in terms of really having assurance around that. The criticality of that, though, or the key aspect of that, is having a trusted authority that can validate that those identities are correct. And it's just about how does that get constructed in a decentralized world, and how does that get architected to give people trust in the system and trust in those identities. But I've no doubt we'll get there, and it will be absolutely key. We do see on the broader piece around big data, we absolutely see organizations that are able now to poll and pull information from a broad array of different platforms, and that gives them a much deeper picture around the individual or the organization they're working with, and then as such the sort of level of risk that they have or potentially are posed by that person or organization, and then they can sort of adapt their approach accordingly.
Is there a danger though, and is the regulator putting pressure on firms to become more sophisticated technologically, and that may be liable to, or may lead to, more things that can break within an organization's framework around financial crime?
I most definitely take the point, and there is definitely a move to a much more technically savvy environment. Generally, we find the regulators to be fairly sensible about these types of things, and they are being fairly proactive, certainly in the UK, around hosting sandboxes and those types of environments, and they'll run hackathons as well and let organizations, but also some of the more sort of startup organizations, to come and trial their technology so they can explore in terms of what might work and what might not work using more realistic data sets. But there's absolutely a risk there as we increase automation, as we bring in things like AI, that we need to have really strong governance around the deployments and the models that they have, to make sure that they are acting in a way that we'd want them to act, and we're not getting some unusual results.
If there's one piece of advice that you'd give to organizations today to keep up with the slew of changes that are happening around them to do with financial crime, what would it be?
It's most definitely get started with something that's really prevalent and a really sort of targeted business challenge. We find there's a huge amount of analysis paralysis almost of organizations that are thinking about all the many things they could do, where there's some really obvious things to get started with. Get started with those, build a strategic framework around them, and the rest will come.
Great. Matt Beattie, thank you so much for your time today. We'll let you go, but first, can you tell us where we can find you? Can we find you personally on LinkedIn, and where can we find your company?
Yeah, you absolutely can. So you can find me on LinkedIn under Matt Beattie, and then you can find our organisation BeyondFS at beyondfs.co.uk.
Great. Matt, thank you so much for your time. We'll speak to you soon.
Thanks very much for your time.